Many of us are familiar with the 12-step programs, often called recovery programs. In recovery programs, there's, especially in Alcoholics Anonymous, there's the 12 steps, the 12 traditions, the 12 promises, and there are also slogans like one day at a time, let go and let God, progress, not perfection, misery is optional, and one that I discovered this week, live life on life's terms. Live life on life's terms. I think that's sort of what the Serenity Prayer is trying to say, that you know so well. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. But as Sheila read for us, there's a full text that goes on, which really speaks about live life on life's terms, taking as he did this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting he would make all things right if I would surrender to his will. Taking this sinful world as it is, living life on life's terms. In a sense, I think that Jesus was kind of a precursor to the Serenity Prayer. After all, on the Mount of Olives, that night before he was to be betrayed and crucified, he said to his disciples, pray that you don't come into a time of trial. In other words, there's no need to welcome suffering. Suffering for suffering's sake is not exalted in our tradition. I think sometimes Christian preachers have preached that suffering on its own is God's will. I don't get that at all. Suffering is inevitable in life, but it's how you walk through that suffering. So Jesus says, pray that you won't come into a time of trial. And then he prays on his own, if you are willing, God, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but yours. I surrender to what is and what may be, but in the midst of that, I'm going to have an attitude of trust. Now, in these prayers, it seems to me, both the Serenity Prayer and the prayer that Jesus prayed, that there's a fine line between acceptance and resignation. Are you with me so far? So, do I accept a world where Sutherland Springs, Texas exists? Am I resigned to a society where mass shootings have become bearable? Do I accept a world, our own society, our own Bay Area, where racism continues to oppress and marginalize whole communities? So the question is, will acceptance, a pillar of the mind, open us to more joy, as the Dalai Lama and as Archbishop Desmond Tutu insist in their Book of Joy? I'm going to invite Watani Steiner to speak about acceptance. For to him, acceptance is not a theory. He has found that fine line between acceptance and resignation, and made of his life a remarkable testament to what acceptance might do.
I have been asked to share something with you on acceptance. What does it mean when we say that we have accepted something in our lives? Do we mean that we have no control and have resigned ourselves to accept what is? Does it mean acquiescence? Are we resigning ourselves to accepting the cards that life has dealt us? These are a few of the questions I have asked and answered for myself as a young boy of the Jim Crow South era. I observed and did what were the acceptable things for blacks to do in this society. I drank from the black water fountain and not from the white fountain because it was the acceptable thing to do. When I went to the back of the bus because it was unacceptable for me to sit in the front seat. I even went around to the back door of Mr. Fontenot's grocery store to buy milk and bread for my mother and grandmother because going through the front door was not the acceptable thing to do. I even stayed on my side of the beach because it was not acceptable for me to venture over to the other side of that long, seemingly endless net, that seemingly endless beach net, separating the white kids from the black. I felt that I had to accept these social restrictions that I could not change. But it was not the kind of acceptance that Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama are talking about. As an angry young teenager of the Black Power era of the mid-1960s, my serenity prayer was not to accept the things I cannot change, but to change the things I cannot accept. Rather than accepting the cards that this society had dealt me, I would deal from a deck from my own choosing. I elected to become a black revolutionary, simply being resigned to their fate and put their hope in the sweet by and by as enslaved human beings. Was I required to accept the discrimination and injustices that I was confronted with as a child in the Jim Crow South? Should my great-grandparents have simply just, given up, resigned the fate that they were in? And should I have not been angry and stand up and declare that I am black, I am proud, and that I am somebody? The answer is complex. It's hard to talk truthfully about the idea of acceptance, depending on who is talking. It can either tip over into denial or into fearful submission, or into a shallow idea of living in the moment. The kind of acceptance I want to embrace is the acceptance that can stand with strength and dignity in the face of injustice and oppression and evil. It is not a soft acceptance or a resignation or a submission. It is intimately related to that powerful revolutionary force, forgiveness. Without forgiveness, there is no possibility of real acceptance. In 1969, I was implicated in a shootout on the UCLA campus in which I was wounded and 2 people were shot and killed. One of the men killed had a wife and a 3-week-old daughter. Although I had no weapon and had not fired a shot, I was tried and convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to life in prison for a crime I did not commit. I was not responsible for the death of her husband and the loss of her child's father. Years later, through God's grace, I would come to understand that although I had not pulled the trigger, I was in fact entrenched in a mindset that was willing to use violence to attain its end. And if all of us on campus that day had not been entrenched in that same mindset, the deaths of two promising young men would not have occurred. Many years later, I would ask the wife of one of those men who were killed for her forgiveness. Forgiveness not for anything that I had done, but for my part in the adversarial atmosphere that caused the death of two human beings. Receiving her forgiveness was an instrumental part of my own healing and acceptance. Of course, I had my own forgiving to do as well. This outrageously racist country had spent centuries honing its oppressive tactics, which I saw bearing down on me, my loved ones, and my whole community. As a passionate young man who wanted to be part of the change, I responded in the most energetic, intense way I could, at the risk of my own life and well-being. For my troubles, I ended up in prison with a life sentence. In prison, I did not elude further racist attacks. I soon learned that white prison guards were setting up black prisoners to be killed, and attempts were made on my own life. I realized that if I stayed in prison, I would not stay alive. I escaped from San Quentin in 1974 and spent 20 years as a fugitive in South America. The endless disruption and continual heartache brought on by American racism has followed me through all these years. Through the denial of my children's right to come to the U.S., and through a sickening abuse of justice which led me to serving 26 years in prison and labeled a domestic terrorist for my attempts to resist. Only released in the end because my senior citizen status, I have had a lot of forgiving to do, and I can't say that it's done. Forgiveness, as I understand it, does not say it's okay that you did that. It says what you did was wrong, and I will continue to affirm your humanity even in the face of that. To the degree that I live in forgiveness, I live in that place of acceptance. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
As so poignantly and beautifully illustrated by Watani's life, his integrity, his honesty, his truth-telling. Acceptance really has very little to do with resignation or defeat. Archbishop Tutu knows that activism comes from a deep acceptance of what is, of reality. Tutu did not accept the inevitability of apartheid, but he did accept its reality, and he worked to change it. Acceptance allows us to move into the fullness of joy. It allows us to engage life on its own terms rather than rail at life for what it is not. So much, dear friends, of our stress and suffering comes from our expectations of how life should be and reacting to that when it is not. Acceptance. I call it the spirituality of what is. My best friend has a mug, and she poured me a cup of coffee, and I looked at the mug, and it says, "It is what it is." A spirituality of what is, but you don't stop there. You say, now what? Now what? We cannot succeed by denying what exists, and the acceptance of reality is the only place from which change can begin. And Tutu says, when you grow in your spiritual life, you are able to accept anything that happens to you. And then you are able to ask, how can we use it as something positive? The wife of one of those men is named Erica. And through an article I read that Watani wrote that was in the Bayview paper in September. In 2012, just a week after the horrific shootings in Newtown, Erica and Watani participated in a restorative justice symposium at San Quentin. They had a packed audience of prisoners and guests, and they told their story about the spiritual power of truth, of forgiveness, and of reconciliation. Acceptance at a micro level and acceptance at a meta level. In the end of that article, Watani says this: "Here is something I have come to understand out of this long and difficult journey. We must be courageous to put out fires that we did not start. We are all inheritors of legacies and histories that we did not create. We are all unwitting participants in injustice we don't consciously support. Accept the things I cannot change. Change the things I cannot accept. Courage and wisdom to know the difference. It is acceptance, coupled with action, that is the gateway to joy. It's a pinnacle of the spiritual life to accept what is, to surrender to a greater power, and then to act from integrity and justice to change those unacceptable things in the world. But it starts with acceptance. So pray it with me. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.